So, by the way, now I'm going to talk to Mohanjit Jolly, the founder of Iron Pillar Fund. They've funded companies like Unifor and in the past now Floats also and Bluestone. So, let's see if Mohanjit's here. He's going to be telling us what's going to happen with investments for the next 10 months or 12 months or so. So, I'm waiting for him. Mohanjit, are you here?
I am indeed. Vishal, how are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for joining us all the way from California.
Happy to do so. And by the way, thank you for making this my very first Insta Live. So apologies if there are any technical difficulties, but honored to be here.
No, I mean, I'm grateful you're probably taking this because, so many of us in India are looking for answers. It's such a young ecosystem. None of us expected this to happen. So we wanted to hear from you. What does it mean to be resilient in a slowing economy? Firstly, I want to say that what do you think? What's going on in the USA? And firstly, are you fine? I mean, how are things back home? I mean, it must be the pandemic's really caught on to a lot of things there. And I see some announcements, and that's scary from a medical front.
Yeah, so I'll make a couple of points which hopefully give everyone on the call some hope, right? So first of all, I think never, perhaps in the history of in history period, has the entire world been united in fighting one enemy, right? So rather than fighting each other and all that, we're actually focused on COVID-19, which is I think something to think about. Second, we are all in this together, right? So all the entrepreneurs, executives, everyone from the upper end of the strata all the way to the base of the pyramid has been democratized, right? So I think we will get through this. This is different than the global financial crisis. It's different than the dot-com boom and bust. But I think one of the first things we have to do, especially those at the front lines in terms of entrepreneurs and leaders, is to take a deep breath, keep yourself physically and mentally sane and safe and healthy. And this is when leadership and citizenship comes together. And I think it will, and it has. And I've seen it in ways that I didn't even imagine in terms of the level of collaboration and cooperation. Personally, we're doing fine. We are, turning what we call a flaw into a feature. So the family is healthy. We're all together. So plenty of family bonding time. So I've coined a new phrase where, social distancing is obviously something that has entered the lexicon. But I've coined a phrase called, virtual proximity. Right. So in a strange way, while we're physically distant, thanks to technology and, video conferencing and Insta Live and that ilk, people have actually come together. I've been actually communicating with folks that I hadn't seen in years. So that's a little bit of a, light, I suppose, or if you want to look at it as a glass, a third full rather than 2/3 empty.
That's a great point. And guys, for those of you who've joined us, I'm with Mohanjit Jolly, the co-founder of Iron Pillar Fund. So if you're a startup looking for answers on what to expect over the next quarter or the next 2 quarters and what's happening with the economy, please feel free to shoot the questions. And I'm going to ask Mohanjit. We're going to try our best to answer them.
Sure.
A lot of questions have already popped up. People are asking me, is it really going to be a bad couple of quarters, or when do you see the economy recovering as an investor?
Yeah, look, I mean, nobody really has a crystal ball here, but what I'll tell you is what, we're telling our portfolio companies, right? So from a contingency planning or cash planning exercise, assume that there is little to no revenue this quarter, right? And even going into next quarter, into the July, August, September quarter, assume that only about 25% of the normal business comes back, and then slowly, steadily, you may not even recover to a full 100% even in a year from now. So from a cash standpoint, right? Cash is king. We've said it many times. It's never been more true than today. If you have it, conserve it. If you have an offer on the table, take it. And if you need to do reductions and cuts and so on, do them early rather than later, and do them deeper rather than shallower, right? These are some sort of sacrosanct, bullet points. And the funny thing is, as part of being at home, the family has gone through a bunch of sort of house cleaning, quite literally. And I stumbled upon some of my quotes and writings that I had provided back in 2008, 2009. And I dug those up and I said, oh my God, these are still just as relevant today as they were, 12 years ago.
Fantastic. There's so many more questions. Let's delve into them,
Yep.
Mohanjit. One of them is, how do you see the retail and, luxury luggage segment, because travel's fallen? How do you see that segment recover? Do you see that coming back in the next couple of quarters?
So I think, again, as I said, this quarter is going to be slow, very, very slow. I mean, look, from an India perspective, I am hearing very, very smart people say things on both sides of the spectrum, right? So on the one side, we're looking at population density and the overall population and the healthcare infrastructure, et cetera, which is concerning. So feeling is that it's going to get much worse before it starts to get better. On the other side is the thought process that, look, we are Indians, right? So we are exposed to a lot more just from our physiology standpoint. So the innate immunity that Indians generally tend to have, and ironically, it's those at the bottom of the pyramid or those who are really exposed are the ones who may actually be more immune. Only time will tell. What I don't want people to walk away with is sort of this unnatural or irrational sense that says, I'm immune and I'm invincible, so I can go ahead and do anything. If anything, that California and the US and obviously parts of Europe have taught us is, to the extent possible, obviously easier to do in a place like US than India, social distancing and so on is going to be very, very important. Now, to your question, when does this start to come back? I think unless this prolongs, right, and as long as some of the measures that are being taken or have been taken, in the recent past in India, if they start bearing fruit, if the curve does start to flatten, I think some of the economic sort of hurdles will be lifted, or if not lifted,
Absolutely.
then loosened, and people will start coming out. The question I have in my mind is the inertia, right? So if people are afraid and somehow feel that they're still at risk.
Yes.
Will the footfalls come back to the malls and to the high street? I'm not quite sure, right? So it all is a waiting game, which is perhaps the hardest thing to do. Obviously for entrepreneurs, but even for the public at large, just not knowing.
So you're going back to cash again, right? That you got to conserve cash.
Absolutely. Especially if you're in a retail business, you are hemorrhaging, right? So we have companies. I mean, I know of companies where you go from very sizable revenue to zero. I mean, that is a shock to the system. And just like when the lockdown went into effect, there wasn't that much time to sort of put a contingency plan or figure out
Absolutely.
the what if scenarios.
Unlike 2008, right? Unlike 2008, where there were bailout plans and all that, here it's not going to work out.
Yeah. I mean, look, U.S. is dealing with we've got the stimulus package that's come out. India, of course, is trying to do their bit, but all I could say is just being honest is hunker down, right, and give yourself as much runway as possible, at least till the end of this year, right, and knowing that maybe even through the first quarter, calendar quarter, or the fiscal year next year. You may not be at full, 100%. So that requires some very, very difficult decisions in terms of, reducing, deferring, laying people off, et cetera. But that's what has to be done because survival is a prerequisite.
In fact, the next question is on that. In case of this recession, many companies have been releasing people. I'm a startup. How do I handle my staff? And how do I handle firing employees? This is from Madhav.
Yeah, this is, by the way, this is one of the hardest things that you will ever have to do is let people go, especially if they've been with you, from the very beginning through thick and thin. So here's what I would recommend. One is transparency is paramount, right? Everybody knows that things are very, very difficult. So don't try to sugarcoat, just tell it as it is. And there are some options, not a whole lot. There are some options. For example, one option could be instead of completely reducing and cutting their salaries, deferring them so that you say, look, as and when normalcy returns, we will make it up to you. We will figure out some sort of formula where whether it's 100% payback, whether it's a 75%, 50%, something like that. That's one. Second, if your staff is willing to work for equity rather than cash, you can actually come up with either part cash, part equity, or all equity to see if that might be a motivation. But at the same time, I mean, if they don't have anything to do, right? If they're simply there on the payrolls and not working on anything because whatever they were working on is effectively shut, then I think do whatever you possibly can in terms of helping them get somewhere else. Give them as much notice, obviously, as possible. But unfortunately, there is collateral damage, and I just don't know how else to sugarcoat it. There will be people who will have to let go, who will have to be let go.
How would you handle such a situation? You've been an entrepreneur before.
Yeah.
Did you ever come across such situations? You've advised companies, and
So I've advised companies, and I've also let people go directly. Yeah. Yeah.
How tough is that? How tough a job is that to let people go? You need to really stomach it, as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. That's why I said, I mean, this is one of the hardest things one will ever have to do. And it was one of the toughest things that I had to go through. And I, believe it or not, I had sleepless nights before, I had sleepless nights after. The only thing I could tell the folks that I had to let go, this was back in the .com bubble and bust. Yes. And we had a small boutique investment bank called Garage.com with Guy Kawasaki, and so we went from 70 people and 6 offices globally, to 4 people in Palo Alto. So we let go of 90% of our brethren, our colleagues. And look, I think empathy, citizenship, leadership, these are aspects that you have to put in place. And just say, look, the reality is in front of us. I mean, it's black and white. It's not like you're hiding anything. You can just go ahead and tell them, look, revenues were X on March 14th or March 1st. Revenues are Y. We simply don't have visibility on when things are going to start to start to improve. So therefore, rather than unfortunately have the entire company crave or just crash. We need to make some decisions, and I wish things were different, but I just want to be honest with you that we simply cannot afford to have X number of people, on the payroll at this time. We simply don't have the revenue or the cash coming in, right? So it's as direct, as that, and then always help. Always say, look, if you need a reference, if you need any other way I can help, let me know.
Man, it sounds brutal, but it seems like we have to do it, but with a lot of empathy. And how do you build that empathy? Like you said, maybe I'm not going to lay you off. Maybe I'm going to employ you back in 3 months. Maybe I'll give you some stock options in the company, get you some work. I mean, maybe get you up and running on some low-end work within the company, maybe some code. If you're an engineer, I don't know. I'm just thinking, I mean, how do you develop empathy at this point of time? Or is empathy weakness?
No. Empathy is strength, my friend. Empathy is not weakness at all. I mean, some people will say, "Look, you've got to, it's business, right? You just got to go and check. You just got to, slash and move on." At least I don't subscribe to that particular thinking, right? So these are human beings. These are people. I always the exercise I go through is put myself in their situation, right? And how would I want to be treated? So that is, if you put that perspective on, I think your mindset will shift, hopefully. If it doesn't, then your DNA is obviously very different than mine. But I think if we just put ourselves in the other person's shoes, I think that brings empathy on board. Okay. For some people, to be honest, it's unnatural. I don't know whether it's a gift or a curse. I just, that's something that is part and parcel of who I am.
Okay, great. There's so many more questions. This is from Vivek, and he says, do you see e-commerce growing? Do you see online sales picking up even in the B2B? There are some fundamental shifts in digital transformation. Is this the time that we move digital completely?
So look, I think you have to look at it as a short term versus a longer term response to that question, right? So there are clearly segments that have seen a windfall as a result of the pandemic, right? Obviously, remote anything, whether it's enterprise productivity, conferences, collaboration, telehealth, I think will take a big positive hit as a result. Anything in the cloud, the infrastructure to the applications that you need to be productive. I mean, those are things that are really benefiting from from this particular crisis. Now, having said that, pretty much everybody is going through what I call a two-phased approach, right? So two-phase approach is, even in VCs, first you look inward. You say, okay, is my business okay? Is my portfolio okay? I think your customers are going through the same exact thing. Once they get to a point where there's some sense of normalcy, you say, okay, I am not unstable, I am metastable or somewhat stable given, what has been thrown at us. But now let me start looking outward. Let me start thinking about building my business all over again. Now, look, I mean, it's not that, needs that your companies were fulfilling have gone away, right? They've taken a break because there are other more pressing issues, unfortunately, that the customers and the entire supply chain has to deal with. But as long as you are on the, what I call the cancer drug to vitamin spectrum, yes, more on the cancer drug side, where it's a must-have, not a nice-to-have, I think those customers will come back and come back in earnest because there will be pent-up demand, and therefore I'm not predicting a V-shape, but I think it's going to be probably closer to that than a tilted L, if you will, okay, in terms of recovery.
Okay, let's take some more questions. A lot of people are asking, the IT industry is going to be hit. What do you think? What do you think about that sector? And obviously, India's big business, right, in terms of IT exports, right, touch about 170 to 180 billion. How is that sector going to be affected? And adding on to that, do you think if my IT company lets me go, is it the right time to start up?
Very, very good question. I mean, I'll answer the second one first, and I'll go to the former. The second one is, so here's, if anyone wants to Google and see which companies were created, for example, in the middle of the global financial crisis, right, 2008, 2009. I was actually talking to a buddy of mine who was at Square, and he reminded me, he said Square was founded in February of 2009, right in at the absolute bottom. I think the bottom was March 9th or something like that, but not too far from that. So look, as a VC, if I see somebody founding a company when the rest of the world is heading for the hills, that to me sends a very strong signal of conviction and how compelling that particular entrepreneur and team are. So that, I think, is a positive, and I predict that a few years from now we'll look back at what I call hindsight will be 2020. So 2020 will be a benchmark from which so many things are going to be measured, and not the least of which is going to be some really, really interesting companies created, and maybe they will be in the segments that are getting a lift from this particular pandemic. Now, going back to the first question in terms of the IT impact. So look, from the IT services standpoint, again, just like I mentioned, there are certain startups that are actually benefiting, others obviously are hurting. Similarly, different sub-verticals within those IT services companies will actually benefit while others take a hit, right? So things like supply chain optimization, things like disaster recovery, things like remote collaboration, and of that ilk. That's where large companies are looking at the IT services giants in India and saying, goodness, this obviously was a once-in-a-lifetime event, but we want to make sure that as and when the next pandemic comes, and unfortunately, I think, in my opinion, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We better be ready with the resilience, the redundancy, the get up and running with a plan B as quickly as possible. So those are I think segments that will benefit, and a lot of this expertise actually resides in India, not necessarily within the four walls of these large Fortune 500 or Global 1000.
Okay. There's a lot of questions, guys. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to ask all these questions as soon as possible. Mr. Fountain had asked me, Does it really affect tech investments during this slowdown? I mean, some are performing better, like education apps, news apps, etc. Can it be said that most VCs are diversified enough to contain the effect of the slowdown? How do you protect your business? Do you think tech investments will slow down? Do you see certain verticals doing better, like education or media? Media, I have another opinion, but go on.
Yeah, I'll let you handle the media piece. But look, just like I alluded to previously, VCs are going through this two-phased approach. Phase one is portfolio triaging. So there's a decision tree, right? So which companies have cash, which don't. Of those that don't, who needs it and how badly versus those who can last longer. And then of those who need it, do we have the capital? Do we have reserves to be able to double down on companies that are doing well versus maybe triaging and packaging them up and going down an M&A path? So I think M&A is actually going to take an uptick as a result, unfortunately, because a lot of companies that were in the middle of fundraising will not be able to raise money. Similarly, there are funds that were in the middle of raising, and these are not the marquee names that you guys will probably be aware of, but those that were in their funds 1, 2, maybe even 3, and were trying to raise their next vehicle. I know of stories directly where it's either collapsed or definitely has been delayed indefinitely. So the VCs are feeling it just as much as the entrepreneurs. But having said that, there is so much dry powder, especially on the India side. I mean, Bain released their annual report, and you can look at it in terms of how much capital is actually sitting on the sidelines. Now, LPs don't pay GPs to have capital sit on the sideline. And so
Absolutely.
that capital will need to be deployed and will be deployed. Having said that, there will be flight to quality, right? It will be slower. So if you were thinking that you could get a fundraise done, for example, in 2 to 3 months, I would say no. I've always advised startups to think, sort of 3 to 4 months at the very least. Now I'm saying that may actually get delayed even more. Having said that, 3 of my buddies here in Silicon Valley have raised their Series A financing in the last 2 weeks, right? So VCs are open for business to the extent that they have, dry powder, and many of them do, both here, of course, but more importantly for the audience in India as well.
Amazing. And that's a great answer. And what about, I'm glad you brought up the point of LPs, right? What about new fundraisers that funds are doing? Do you see them going out and raising money actively now? Because 8 months down, I think when the world settles down, there's going to be a great opportunity to find new companies, like you said, right? New startups, new type of business.
Absolutely. So look, I think if you have an established name, so I'll give you a couple that are out here. Mayfield has raised their next fund. General Catalyst just raised, 3 separate funds. So if you have that marquee name, if you have the pedigree, I think LPs who've been through these cycles before know that things are going to come back. And just like you pointed out, now is the time to go shopping, right? Now is when valuations do subside. Great companies figure out a way to not only survive but thrive through these times. So it's a wonderful opportunity to go and invest. Yeah.
Great. There's a question around, okay, yes, you talked about, entrepreneurs letting people go, but what's your suggestion to people who've been let go? How should they look at this situation now? What advice do you give them?
Yeah, look, I think, first and foremost, you have to take care of yourself, meaning your physical and mental health. It's a very, very difficult time, especially if you're cash strapped and those sorts of things. But again, I'm always looking at opportunities, right? So if, for example, you have been let go, you do not have your next thing lined up immediately, and hopefully you have either some savings or you're living, in a joint family, so the day-to-day needs are taken care of. Take advantage of this opportunity to reskill, upskill, learn something new that you think is going to be beneficial for your next thing, right? And I keep telling people, this is an area of very strong and dear passion for me, is as people's life expectancy increases, this whole definition of a career has gone out the window. So you're going to have multiple careers over your lifetime, especially for the young people in India. And therefore, it will be crucial to continuously learn, maybe unlearn and relearn new skills as and when, if you happen to be in the tech sector and new technologies are coming in. Never have you had this sort of this opportunity, if you will, fall in your lap, as difficult as that may be, given that you may have been just let go. But take advantage of this opportunity and say, okay, what is the best that I can do with this googly that's been thrown at me?
Yes.
And so I can either sulk and feel sorry for myself, or I can, pick myself up and say, okay, I've got this time. Let me make the most of whether it's family time or God, I mean, if even a hobby. I mean, I'm learning sign language, for example. That's something that I had on my list. I said, okay, what can I do? And I could do it with my family. So turn this into an opportunity to the extent possible.
By the way, guys, what he says is absolutely right. Your mental health is very important. I've been through 3 downturns, and each time, as a journalist, media companies do cut costs. As a cub reporter, I had to. But by the way, you can hustle. You have to hustle. Make sure that you don't sit quiet. Like he said, you have to reskill, or you have to have a network that'll take you in quickly, right? That's the only way, right, MJ?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that point, I think, unfortunately, perhaps doesn't come naturally or is not talked about enough with with the tech entrepreneurs, for example, or entrepreneurs in general, people in general, is networking. Getting to know people is so crucial, right? And be authentic. It's not just putting a logo or putting a name that says, I know this person, but actually get to know them, because that is how, if I look at my 30-year journey, I have never applied for any job. It's just things have fallen in my lap. And I have this, I'll spend a minute on this. I have this concept called engineering serendipity, okay? Engineering your own luck. And so we may call it karma, we may call it whatever, but how do you engineer serendipity is you surround yourself with people who are smarter than you are, and you give unconditionally. If you do those 2 things, good things will happen, right? And people will see that even in downturns, you came to their help. I mean, I am taking calls from entrepreneurs that I have nothing to do with. They're not in my portfolio, but I give, because this is the time when you have something to give, whatever it may be, do. Because people will remember it, a year, 5 years, 10 years